What happens when the justice system gets it so wrong that the real killer walks free while an innocent man rots in prison? And what if that innocent man becomes something far worse than the original criminal? This is a story that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, redemption, and the price of getting it wrong. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This content may not be suitable for all audiences, especially younger viewers or those sensitive to gore.
You are watching True Crime Lens.
It's December 1st, 2001, Paris, France. The morning air was cold and bitter as a homeless man wandered the streets of Neuilly-sur-Seine. He was just looking for somewhere warm to sleep. Near the Neuilly-sur-Seine Bridge, he spotted a stairwell, perfect shelter from the wind. But as he approached, something stopped him cold. There, lying motionless on the concrete steps, was a woman. Blood everywhere, covering her face, her chest pooling beneath her body. The man flagged down a group of firefighters who happened to be nearby. They rushed to help, but it was too late. She was already gone. When police arrived at the scene, they found a crime that made no sense. The victim had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, with wounds so deep that one measured 15 centimeters. Her gym clothes were disheveled, pulled down in a way that suggested sexual assault, yet the autopsy would later reveal no evidence of rape. 2 rum bottles lay nearby. One bore fingerprints, the other was stained with blood and hair. But the victim's purse and gym bag, nowhere to be found. Strangely though, her jewelry remained untouched. The transit card in her jacket pocket quickly revealed her identity. Marie-Agnès Bedeau, 45 years old, an executive assistant with 3 children. In her hand, she clutched a work phone. As investigators processed the scene, that phone began to ring. One of her children calling to check why mom hadn't come home from the gym. A woman with no enemies, no dangerous relationships, no reason for anyone to want her dead. But someone did want her dead. The question was, who? The police had practically nothing to work with. No witnesses saw the attack. The murder weapon was missing, likely taken by the killer. The fingerprints on the rum bottle led nowhere. This was looking like it might become another cold case. Then, the day after the murder, investigators caught their first break. A nurse came forward with a disturbing story. At 7:30 that morning, she'd been walking across the pedestrian bridge near the crime scene when a young man approached her. He was aggressive, making what she called a nasty advance. When she refused and tried to walk away, he became more threatening. Terrified, she ran. Fortunately, he didn't chase her. The timing was perfect. The location was right. This had to be their killer. The nurse provided a detailed description. European appearance, speaking perfect French with no accent. About 5'9", with dark hair slicked back. Most distinctively, he wore a brown bomber jacket with a shearling collar. Police created a composite sketch and distributed it to stations across Paris. Within days, an officer in Suez recognized the face. It looked exactly like an 18-year-old who had been arrested the previous year for sexual assault in an apartment building lobby. His name was Marc Machin. Now 19 years old, Marc had quite the criminal record for someone so young. Multiple arrests for fights, vandalism, theft. Just months before Bedeau's murder, he'd been convicted of another assault. The pattern was escalating, and it all fit. When investigators showed the nurse a photo lineup including Marc's picture, she hesitated, but then pointed directly at him. "That's him," she said. "I'm sure of it." On December 13th, police arrested Marc at his father's house in the 19th arrondissement. As they searched his room, they found several knives, including a switchblade, and a brown bomber jacket, stained with what appeared to be blood. But Marc protested his innocence. He claimed he had an alibi, that he'd been sleeping at a friend's apartment on the night of the murder. The problem was, Marc was a heavy drug user with a chaotic lifestyle. His memories of 2 weeks ago were hazy at best, and when police questioned his friends, none of them remembered him being there. During interrogation, investigators used every technique they could think of. They reminded Marc repeatedly that his father was a police officer, promising leniency if he just confessed. They suggested the murder wasn't planned, that maybe Bedott had fought back and Marc was just defending himself. And slowly, Marc began to crack. His life story was a catalog of trauma and abandonment. Born in 1982, Marc was taken from his parents at age 5 after a violent domestic dispute where his mother fired his father's service weapon into a wall. He spent years in foster care where he was sexually assaulted by an older boy. His mother died of AIDS when he was 9. The only stability he'd known was living with his grandparents in southern France, which he later called the best years of his life. But when his grandmother died of cancer in 1994, that stability disappeared. Marc bounced from home to home, his behavior becoming increasingly violent and erratic. By 1995, when his father started dating again, Marc's rage exploded. He attacked his father's new partner, both physically and verbally. He started using drugs at 14. He was kicked out of multiple group homes for fighting. This was a young man the system had failed at every turn, and now, under intense police pressure, he finally gave them what they wanted. Marc confessed to killing Marie-Agnès Bedott. According to his confession, he'd stolen bottles of alcohol from a convenience store, sold some to buy drugs, then wandered the streets drinking and smoking until he found himself at the Neuilly-sur-Seine Bridge at dawn. His next memory, he claimed, was waking up with a knife in his hand, blood at his feet, and Bedott's body on the stairs. He said he threw the knife into the Seine River, went home, showered off the blood, and tried unsuccessfully to sleep. At his first court hearing, Marc repeated this confession. He told the judge, "I regret what I did. I need help. I hurt that woman. It's normal for me to go to prison. I harm people, myself and others. I need to be punished." But there were problems with Marc's story, some big problems. He claimed Bedott was lying on her back when he found her, but she was actually discovered face down. The fingerprints on the rum bottle didn't match his. The blood on his bomber jacket was tested, and it was his own blood, not Bedott's. No trace of his DNA was found on her body. Worst of all, whenever Marc's father visited him in detention, Marc would deny any involvement in the murder. On January 8, 2002, Marc appeared before the judge again. This time, he completely recanted his confession. He explained that he'd only confessed because of the psychological pressure from police. He thought if he gave them what they wanted, they'd stop the constant interrogations. Since he knew he was innocent, he figured he'd be cleared before trial anyway. As for how he knew details about the crime, Marc claimed the police had shown him the case file and crime scene photos during questioning, saying, "We're going to refresh your memory, you little bastard." The police denied this manipulation completely, and despite the lack of physical evidence, the case against Marc moved forward. They conducted a reconstruction at the bridge, bringing the nurse to view Marc in person. She identified him again, even as Marc shouted that the reconstruction was meaningless, that it was being done in daylight when the original incident occurred in darkness. But it was enough for the judges. Marc was charged with murder and remained in detention awaiting trial. On May 22, 2002, 47-year-old Maria Judite Araujo left her apartment at dawn to visit a friend. She was a Portuguese office cleaner who regularly crossed the Neuilly-sur-Seine Bridge during her commute. When she didn't arrive at her destination and missed her weekly visit with her son, her family grew worried. The next day, a passerby made a horrific discovery on the same stairs where Bedott had been found. Araujo's body was curled in a fetal position at the bottom of the steps. The positioning of her clothing indicated potential sexual violence. Her face was covered in brutal injuries. Unlike Bedott's case, there was clear evidence of sexual assault. The murder weapon was different too. Instead of a knife, the killer had used a broken bottle, stabbing Araujo with the sharp fragments. One piece was still embedded in her neck when police arrived. Her handbag was stolen, making identification difficult until her son reported her missing and recognized her photo at the police station. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore. Same location, same type of victim, same brutal methodology. Marc's lawyers immediately recognized the connection and brought it to the attention of investigators. The response was dismissive and almost insulting. The head investigator asked Marc's attorney, "You wouldn't want me to indict your client for acts that occurred while he was already in detention, would you?" The presiding judge claimed there weren't enough similarities to connect the cases. When Marc's family requested that DNA from both murders be compared, the request was denied. Police did find one potential suspect in Araujo's case, a homeless German man who had been seen making inappropriate gestures near the bridge. But his DNA didn't match, and he was released. The investigation stalled completely. Meanwhile, Marc's case proceeded to trial. On September 8, 2004, Marc Machin faced a jury at the Nanterre court. Even the prosecutors seemed to doubt the case, telling a journalist off the record that he had no certainty about it. The evidence was virtually non-existent. The prosecution's main strategy was simply to highlight Marc's criminal history and paint him as the type of person who would commit such a crime. Marc didn't help himself either. He came across as arrogant and aggressive, seemingly unaware of the gravity of his situation. The public, already prejudiced by his past, saw him as what one observer called the ideal culprit. Even his own attorney seemed more focused on reducing his sentence than proving his innocence, spending most of his time discussing Marc's troubled background rather than the gaping holes in the prosecution's case. The final nail in the coffin was the nurse's testimony. Once again, she identified Marc with confidence. When he continued to deny ever meeting her, the prosecution argued that his denial itself proved his guilt. The trial lasted just one day. After minimal deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty. Marc Machin was sentenced to 18 years in prison for the murder of Marie-Agnès Bedeau. His attorney told him the case was hopeless and urged him not to appeal. Marc's response was defiant: "If you don't believe in my innocence and my good faith, go to hell." He fired his lawyer and filed an appeal himself. The appeal process brought a new court-appointed attorney who actually fought for Marc's innocence. He pointed out the obvious problems. The murder weapon didn't match the wounds, there was no DNA evidence, no physical proof whatsoever. But on November 30th, 2005, the conviction was upheld. Marc could potentially be released in 2013 with time served and good behavior. In prison, Marc fell into severe depression. He went on multiple hunger strikes. In 2006, his final appeal to the Court of Cassation was rejected. Officially, Marc had exhausted all legal options. He had given up hope. Then, on March 4th, 2008, everything changed. A man walked into a police station in La Défense and asked to speak to detectives. He was 33 years old, soft-spoken, and clearly troubled. His name was David Sagno. "I have things to say to ease my conscience," he told the officers. "I killed 2 people in the past. One on December 1st, 2001, on the Neuilly-sur-Seine Bridge. The other on May 22nd, 2002, also on the Neuilly-sur-Seine Bridge." David knew details about both murders that had never been made public. He knew Araujo's name because he'd stolen her handbag and seen her identification. He referred to Bedeau by her married name Doucet, a detail that had been kept from the press. He remembered exactly what both women were wearing, even the weather conditions on those days. David Sagno's life had been a series of tragedies and missed opportunities. Born prematurely in 1974, one of 9 children in a Guinean immigrant family, he'd been a timid child who never fit in at school. He witnessed domestic violence at home and struggled with what appeared to be developmental delays. By 1991, David had fallen into alcoholism and homelessness. He couldn't hold a job despite his siblings' attempts to help him. In 1995, while intoxicated, he'd attacked a woman at a bus stop with a knife. She escaped, and David immediately turned himself in, saying he wanted to protect others from himself. He served 2 years for that assault, but upon release, nothing had changed. He remained homeless, jobless, unable to form meaningful relationships. In late November 2001, David was staying at a homeless shelter run by the Missionary Sisters of Charity. On November 30th, he stole a bread knife from their kitchen and left to spend the night in a basement nearby. The next day was December 1st. According to David's confession, he had no real motive for attacking Bedeau. He simply saw her and felt compelled to kill. He stabbed her twice in the chest then realized she was still alive and stabbed her repeatedly until she died. He also admitted to sexually assaulting both her body and her corpse, though the autopsy had found no evidence of this. After the murder, he stole some of her belongings and a CD, then took the metro back to the shelter and threw the knife in their trash bin. David had no idea anyone had been arrested for Bedot's murder. By February 2002, still believing the case was unsolved, he deliberately committed acts of vandalism, hoping to be caught and imprisoned so he'd have food and shelter. But nobody arrested him. Araujo's murder was equally senseless. David woke up on May 22nd with what he described as an overwhelming urge to kill someone. He returned to the bridge, saw Araujo walking with a black umbrella, and took that as a sign she should be his victim. He pushed her down the stairs, strangled her, then killed her with a broken beer bottle when she continued breathing. He sexually assaulted her then. In the most disturbing detail of his confession, he licked her blood from the steps, believing it would give him strength. David's confessions revealed a man driven by occult beliefs and ritualistic thinking. He developed these ideas from books he'd read in libraries and from his mother's attempts to cure his mental illness through what she called rituals. He believed that by killing these women, he could absorb their power and strength. He told police he considered himself an immortal being. But there were inconsistencies in David's story about Bedot's murder. He said she wasn't wearing jewelry, but she was. He claimed he'd sexually assaulted her, but there was no evidence. When shown photos of similar-looking women, he couldn't identify Bedot correctly. Confronted with these errors, David initially recanted his confession about Bedot, saying he'd made it up for attention. He'd learned the details from press coverage. However, he maintained his confession about Araujo's murder, but the DNA evidence told the real story. Samples from both crime scenes were tested against David's DNA. The results were definitive. David Sagno had killed both women. Meanwhile, Marc Machin's DNA was nowhere to be found. Despite their initial reluctance to admit their catastrophic error, police and prosecutors were forced to acknowledge reality. David was charged with both murders, and on July 1st, 2008, Marc's release was ordered. But Marc couldn't help himself. Just before his scheduled release, he assaulted a prison guard, adding 3 more months to his sentence. On October 7th, 2008, after nearly 7 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Marc Machin walked free. In February 2012, David Sagno faced trial for both murders. His guilt was undeniable, so his defense focused entirely on his mental state, arguing he should be committed to a psychiatric facility rather than imprisoned. The court concluded that while David's mental illness was a factor, it wasn't severe enough to warrant an acquittal. On February 23rd, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Marc's retrial finally took place on December 17, 2012. Despite overwhelming evidence of his innocence, the proceedings dragged on for 4 days, partly because the presiding judge kept calling in sick. On December 20th, 2012, Marc Machin was formally acquitted of all charges related to Bedot's murder. He became only the 8th person since 1945 to be legally recognized by a French court as wrongfully convicted. You might think this is where the story ends, that Marc, finally vindicated, would rebuild his life and become an advocate for criminal justice reform. Unfortunately, you would be wrong. After his release in 2008, Marc briefly became a media sensation. He appeared on television programs, wrote a book about his experiences, and was featured in documentaries. The French public, horrified by the miscarriage of justice, embraced him as a sympathetic figure. That goodwill evaporated on June 15, 2009. Marc was arrested and charged with 3 sexual assaults, 2 against minors aged 14 and 15. He had attacked them in an apartment building lobby while they were visiting their grandmother. Most shockingly, he had filmed the assaults on his own phone. At his 2010 trial, Marc admitted to everything, claiming, "I was caught up by my old demons. My anger and frustration took over my thinking." He was sentenced to 3 years in prison with 5 years of probation. Released in December 2011, Marc was ordered to wear an ankle bracelet and live in a supervised group home. He was kicked out for fighting with other residents. On New Year's Eve, he violated his curfew and disappeared. When arrested at a hospital 5 days later, being treated for injuries from a fight, he was sent back to prison for violating probation. This pattern continued relentlessly. In January 2013, less than a month after his acquittal, Marc was involved in another altercation in his apartment building, slapping a neighbor and stealing his phone. In 2014, Marc received over 663,000 euros in compensation from the French government for his wrongful conviction, one of the largest such payouts in French history. Within months, he had squandered most of it on legal fees, hotels, alcohol, prostitutes, and frivolous spending. In 2015, Marc's girlfriend filed domestic violence charges against him. He went into hiding at a hotel until his arrest in January 2016. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and ordered to pay his ex-girlfriend 50,000 euros in compensation. Released in April 2017, Marc was completely broke. His lawyer was forced to admit publicly he hasn't matured. On April 21, 2018, a 22-year-old woman reported a horrific crime. A man with his face covered had forced his way into her apartment, held a knife to her throat, and brutally assaulted her sexually. He forced her to perform oral sex, made her clean up evidence of the crime he committed, then stole her bank card to withdraw money from an ATM. CCTV footage from the ATM showed the rapist's distinctive neck tattoos. DNA evidence confirmed what police already suspected. Marc Machin had crossed the line from victim to predator. On October 14, 2021, the same court that had acquitted Marc of Bedot's murder convicted him of rape committed with a weapon, extortion, fraud, theft, and home invasion. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Marc waived his right to appeal, making the sentence final. He now has 15 criminal convictions on his record. David Sagno, the man who actually murdered Marie-Agnès Bedot and Maria Judith Araujo, will be eligible for parole in March 2028. Marc Machin, the man wrongfully convicted of Bedot's murder, will likely remain in prison long after David's release. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, redemption, and the unintended consequences of systemic failure. Was Marc's transformation from victim to predator caused by his wrongful imprisonment, or was it inevitable given his history of violence and sexual assault that predated his conviction? The French justice system failed everyone in this case. They failed Marie-Agnès Bedot and Maria Judith Araujo by not catching their real killer. They failed Marc Machin by convicting him on virtually no evidence. They failed David Sagno by not identifying his mental illness and getting him help before he killed. But perhaps most troubling of all, they may have created a monster where none existed before. Today, David Sagno is described as a model prisoner. He spends his time reading and writing detective stories. He has received treatment for his addictions and mental disorders. Marc Machin remains behind bars, his compensation money gone, his reputation destroyed, his life a cautionary tale about the price of getting justice wrong. Sometimes there are no winners in the pursuit of justice, only different kinds of victims. What do you think went wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases.